Do you remember Uncharted, the revolutionary action-adventure game series developed by Sony's premier game studio? Naughty Dog's decade-defining game, the title that changed how games were made, the game that made the industry truly change? Naughty Dog used to be loved, and to many they still are, from developing the revolutionary 3D platformer Crash Bandicoot 1, 2, and 3, to the ever-enjoyable Jak and Daxter, the unique sandbox Jak 2 and 3, the respective racing spin-offs too. They are one of the most acclaimed game studios of the 2000s, and by the mid-2000s though, the studio wanted to move on to something different. A project that would revolutionize gaming even further, and they made a title that did. Going from cartoony platformers to dark grit and grime was expected of quirky platformers in the aughts. This was the decade of Shadow the Hedgehog, but Uncharted? That's different. It was something special. Uncharted did more for the gaming industry than anything else Naughty Dog has made. Arguably the most notable cinematic game, and inarguably the most praised. Uncharted Drake's Fortune might have always been a rough game, with many flaws, but rewind back to 2007 and compare it to what was out at the time. This game came out 1 year after the first Gears of War, and both worked to move gaming shooters to the third person. However, unlike Gears, Uncharted was much more focused on storytelling, something PlayStation would pivot almost all of their third-party and first-party output to doing after a certain amount of success. Speaking of storytelling, Uncharted 1 is good. Well over a decade later, you can easily see why so many loved it. Is the story a little dated to what is expected in modern movie games? Yes, but there's a timelessness to this game's plot. It's aged quite well, and unlike many modern games that have tried to recapture Uncharted, this game has soul. The easiest way to talk about Uncharted is by realizing how much soul the game has. Even when the gunplay was bad, or I missed a platform, the camera was weird, or a boss was nearly impossible to beat, the game always had a heart to it. That heart, the soul of Uncharted, is why it's aged so relatively finely. Look at some of the other PS3 and Xbox 360 era movie games. The best ones today are the ones without edge. The ones that are soulless have been forgotten about. There's a reason people want Uncharted Drake's Fortune remade. It isn't because the game is necessarily amazing nowadays, it's because it's got something special in it. The gameplay of Uncharted isn't special either. In fact, it's aged incredibly poorly. One of the biggest issues is the platforming, which is unexpectedly stiff considering Naughty Dog's past work. Some jumps should reach the next platform and don't, while others just don't even work. Nathan Drake also controls weirdly, which is a lot more reasonable since he's a human being and not a bandicoot, or some sort of human elf creature. Regardless of any issues with the basic moveset of Nathan Drake, the gameplay is mainly filler between the major story beats, and sometimes the filler can be fun while other times it's not. I won't spoil anything, but when the major part happens in the story and the game gets a little bit creepier, the gameplay gets really fun for a short while. Mowing down those enemies felt great. The gunplay of Uncharted is also nothing special. After all, it is a third-person shooter on controller. It's just slow, and the lack of zooming in on a button press, like most third-person shooters, was painful, especially when you have to pick off enemies far away from you, who are well above the usual arena. Without a sniper rifle, these became wastes of bullets. It's hard to aim with the circle when the enemy is barely a dot on screen. When you have a sniper rifle though, those few shots are awesome and super rewarding. If they were more common, the game would have been a whole lot more fun. The biggest issue with the gunplay in the first Uncharted is how bad most weapons feel, and how weak they are compared to the enemies. Every enemy in this game either starts off as a bullet sponge or becomes a bullet sponge, so if you aren't hitting constant headshots, combat becomes a drag. Coupled with the length of each section and how once Nate dies, you're restarting a 5 to 10 minute gunfight, the game feels a bit more dragging as time goes on. This isn't a particularly long game, in fact it's surprisingly short. It does feel longer though when you're dying more than once for fights where you shouldn't, or restarting the entire gameplay section off a jump that didn't connect. Some other issues have to do with the camera angles, which randomly during platforming turns to a fixed camera angle akin to the old Resident Evil games, which, if you're used to playing in third person, a sudden change in perspective leads to disorientation and some easily messed up platforming. Luckily, the saves and checkpoints are frequent enough that you aren't set back all too far, if you're sent back at all. The highlight for me, at least in the remaster, are the graphics. They look modern, the colors are so lush, and the art style is vibrant. The game just has a nice look to it. This is one of the big parts of the game's soul. You wouldn't be mistaken for thinking about movie games as having darker art styles with gritty aesthetics, but the first Uncharted doesn't. It's actually got a diverse aesthetic, taking you from catacombs through jungle into an old ship and across rapids. It's much more fun to play because you're always seeing new locations with a bright art style too. Character models in the remaster also are high quality, same with gun models and even the explosions. I thoroughly enjoyed Uncharted because the graphics still sold the adventure to me. The story of Uncharted Drake's Fortune was also a highlight. This series has been compared to Indiana Jones, and for good reason. This game has a movie-style charm to it. It's got the heart of the old Spielberg Indiana Jones films, in its story especially, and villains who felt straight out of a cartoon and all. The story follows the protagonist Nathan Drake, his mentor Sully, and a journalist who eventually becomes an explorer named Elena. These three characters and their interactions make the game, from the jokes of Nate and Sully to the candid dialogue between Nate and Elena, and everything else in between. Nathan Drake partakes on his quest to find El Dorado and encounters trouble as he goes on. Plot twists ensue and the game ends off great. I won't go into much because all of the story beats between the start and ending were so enjoyable, and I don't want to take them away from someone new to the series. I'm glad I went into this game unspoiled, and I don't want to risk spoiling someone else. I'll say this though, the drama and romance between Nate and Elena was super fun to see, and really made some of the gameplay shine in the scenarios with the two exploring together. Back to the antagonists. There's a few here, and one is this goofy type, while the others are much more serious. The contrast between the former and the latters made the game even more enjoyable to get through. There's a scene in this story with Nate and one of them close to the end. That was another highlight. I haven't gone too much in the ending, and I barely mentioned it, and I don't plan on doing that. I will mention my problems with the ending. I didn't have any, but I did, however, have problems with the final boss leading to it. It was difficult and a massive spike in the difficulty from what had come from the 7 hours prior. Part of the issue with the final boss is the randomness and change of gameplay. The other issue was the weapons you had. The shotgun is terrible in the first Uncharted, and yet in the first phase of the boss fight, you're forced to snipe with it while they're using M4s. Once you understand the way the boss shoots, it becomes easier, but this gunfight was a stressful time that I did not enjoy. For example, the boss will shoot the crate you hide behind. If you're playing too carefully, you could end the fight without anywhere else to take cover. The trick to this fight, though, is to wait for the third shot to take cover. After that, immediately hide. Still, I understood the attack pattern. I had enough trouble regardless. One final piece of advice, ignore the boss. Shoot the side enemies. Luckily, there's a checkpoint at the second area, so it's easier to get past after you reach it. When I played Uncharted Drake's Fortune, I played on the PlayStation 4 version using my PS5, so I don't know too much about the original. I do own the game on PS3. In fact, I've owned the whole series on the platform since I was back in middle school. For some reason, I never played them there. If you play the remastered versions, at least the game has aged decently well. Sure, gunplay is mediocre, hand-to-hand combat is next to useless, and the difficulty is hard even on the easiest option, but I still enjoyed the game for what it was. And yes, of course, the platforming is also rough, and I was definitely closer to quitting the game for good because of the final boss fight too. But I think the game has aged well regardless. What has aged phenomenally was the story, and for a movie game, that's the main thing to focus on. And if you focus on it, you'll enjoy it. I know I did. The set pieces have also aged well, whether it's shooting down enemies while Elena's driving through the jungle, or blowing up barrels and enemies while Nate's driving a Sea-Doo, or solving some simple puzzles, navigating a temple, exploring ancient architecture, climbing anything, or engaging in a shootout. Uncharted Drake's Fortune's highs are good enough to justify the few lows. So has it aged well? Yeah, I'd say so. Should you play it? Yeah, I think so. I think it's still worth it. The game's free on PS Plus Premium, and the collection is on sale for $10 constantly. And used copies are around that price too. I personally bought a used copy physically, and I'd say just off the first game, the purchase was worth it. If you're a Sony fan, this is a must play. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like or comment something below, as any support helps. I normally cover Japanese games, as it's what I usually play, but I really enjoyed my time with the first Uncharted, so I managed to throw together this small video in between some of my bigger videos that I have in the works currently. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.